All right, so today we're diving into this book that's causing a bit of a stir. It's called Outlasting the Gay Revolution, and it's by Dr. Michael Brown. We had
Yeah.
a lot of requests from listeners to really get into the arguments he makes, and, well, let's just say he doesn't hold back.
Yeah, it's definitely a pretty direct challenge to how a lot of people think about these issues today. Brown's arguing that what he calls the gay revolution is based on a foundation that's not very solid, and he thinks we're actually headed for a pretty big cultural shift away from it.
He's pretty upfront about what he believes, right? Like traditional marriage gender roles being distinct, and he really seems to push back against what he sees as a homosexual activist agenda.
Exactly. And he doesn't just sort of lay out his viewpoint, he offers a whole plan of action for people who agree with him. He calls them his 8 principles for the counter-revolution. But, just to be clear, we're not here to say whether he's right or wrong. The goal is to understand what he's actually saying, especially the parts that might be surprising to people.
Right. We're all about trying to understand different perspectives here, even the ones that maybe make us a little uncomfortable. So his first principle is never compromise your convictions. What's he getting at with that?
Well, he argues that Christians are under a ton of pressure to just abandon what they've always believed about sexuality. But he thinks standing firm is super important, like crucial. He actually compares it to the pressure to give in to the Nazis during World War II.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty intense comparison. Is that a little extreme?
It might seem that way at first, but he uses a really interesting historical parallel.
Yeah.
He talks about Winston Churchill's never give in speech. Most people think of it as this wartime rally cry, but it wasn't to soldiers. It was actually to students at Harrow School back in 1941. And he was urging them to stand strong against the Nazis, even when it seemed like all hope was lost.
Okay, I see where he's going with that. So basically, Christians today need that same kind of unwavering spirit in the face of what he sees as this huge push for everyone to accept homosexuality.
Exactly. He's saying that gay activists are in it for the long haul. Their goal is nothing less than total normalization of homosexuality. And anyone who disagrees gets pushed to the margins.
He even says that Christians who hold these traditional views are actually facing intolerance and persecution. He gives some specific examples, right?
He does. He points to a bunch of incidents that he thinks really show this point. One of the most striking ones is that whole Houston subpoena incident.
Oh yeah, that one made headlines.
Yeah.
Remind me what happened there.
So in 2014, Houston passed this non-discrimination ordinance. It included protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Well, a group of pastors opposed the ordinance, and they were involved in trying to get it put up for a public vote. So the city, in response, subpoenaed sermons and emails from these pastors. They wanted access to their private communications.
That's wild. Was it really about their beliefs, or was the city just trying to get evidence about the petition drive?
That's the question, right? And it actually went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court. Brown sees it as this attempt to intimidate anyone who challenged the gay agenda. He's saying it reveals a deeper strategy to silence people who disagree.
So for him, it's not just an isolated incident. It's a sign of something much bigger.
Exactly. And it's not just about pastors or individuals. Churches are feeling the pressure to conform, too.
He gave that example from Denmark, didn't he?
Yeah. After Denmark legalized same-sex marriage, clergy in the state church were required to perform those weddings, even if it went against their beliefs. It's a pretty dramatic example of how fast things can change.
Yeah, it makes you think about religious freedom and the separation of church and state.
And the pressure doesn't stop at churches. It extends to Christian-owned businesses, too. Brown talks about cases where bakers, photographers, other business owners, they were penalized for refusing to provide services for same-sex weddings because of their religious beliefs.
He's talking about that conflict between anti-discrimination laws and the right of business owners to operate according to their faith.
Right. And it gets really tricky because both sides have points. How do you balance religious freedom with being free from discrimination? Brown thinks the scales are tipping too far in one direction, and people are losing their livelihoods because of what they believe.
He also mentioned efforts to limit counseling and therapy for people struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction, especially minors.
Yeah, that's another area where she sees a dangerous precedent.
Yeah.
He argues that these bans on therapy essentially take away freedom of choice. Imagine someone, even with their parents' consent, being denied access to therapy they think could help them align their desires with their values.
It's a tough issue. It gets to the heart of self-determination and what therapy is even for. He even shares a document written by people who experience same-sex attraction but don't want to act on it. They feel like they're being silenced.
It's definitely a perspective that doesn't get a lot of attention. Brown uses it to show that the LGBTQ community isn't a monolith. There's a lot of diversity of thought and experience within that community, and assuming everyone is okay with their same-sex attractions just isn't true.
He also talked about Tony Dungy, the NFL coach, who got a lot of backlash for saying he wouldn't draft an openly gay player because of potential distractions.
That's another example he uses to illustrate this trend of punishing people for expressing opinions that go against the idea of accepting homosexuality. It makes you wonder if there's really room for open discussion on these topics, or if dissenting voices are just getting shut down.
He also mentioned Dr. McCaskill. She was suspended from her job as the university's chief diversity officer because she signed a petition supporting traditional marriage.
That case raises questions about what tolerance really means. Can someone with traditional views on marriage actually promote diversity and inclusion? Brown thinks assuming they can't is unfair, and it limits genuine understanding and dialogue.
It's almost like he's saying that just having a different opinion on this topic gets you labeled as intolerant. He points to examples like Carrie Prejean, the Miss California runner-up, who got criticized for supporting traditional marriage during the Miss USA pageant.
Exactly. And then there's the Mozilla CEO, Brendan Eich. He had to resign after it came out that he donated to a campaign supporting California's Proposition 8, which was about banning same-sex marriage. Brown sees these as evidence of a cancel culture, using public shaming and pressure to silence people who disagree.
He even talked about how some universities are restricting Christian groups because their leaders have to adhere to certain values, including those relating to sexuality. It's like there's a systematic effort to push traditional views on sexuality out of the mainstream.
That's definitely his perspective. And it all goes back to his first principle, never compromise your convictions. He believes that standing up for what you believe, even when it's unpopular, is more important now than ever.
But isn't there a way to stand up for what you believe without being hateful or discriminatory?
That's a great question. And it leads us right into his second principle, which is take the highest moral ground.
Okay, so how does he suggest people do that?
He actually encourages people to resist fighting fire with fire. He thinks responding to hate with love is the most effective way to disarm your critics and change their minds.
That sounds tough,
Ah,
especially when you feel attacked.
it's not easy, he admits that, but he illustrates the principle with this really powerful story from his own life.
I'm curious, what happened?
Well, there was a protest against his church, specifically because of his stance on homosexuality. Protesters were outside yelling hateful things, calling him names, trying to disrupt the service.
Wow, that must have been stressful.
It was. But instead of getting angry, his congregation responded with kindness. They offered the protesters water and snacks. They talked to them respectfully. They basically tried to show them love.
Did it work?
It's amazing, but it did. The protest leader was so touched by their response that he apologized to Brown, and they ended up having dinner together.
That's incredible. It's like turning the other cheek. It sounds like he's saying that showing grace can be more effective than any argument.
Exactly. He emphasizes not stooping to personal attacks, even when you're being attacked yourself. He believes that responding with love while staying true to your values is the most powerful way to engage in these difficult conversations.
He also had some strong thoughts about certain organizations that he feels misrepresent opposition to the gay agenda.
Yeah, he specifically called out the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, for labeling groups like the Family Research Council as hate groups, just because of their stance on homosexuality.
He really doesn't like the idea that opposing same-sex marriage makes you hateful or bigoted. He believes you can disagree with someone's lifestyle or choices without hating them as a person.
He uses examples like Chick-fil-A. They face boycotts because the CEO supports traditional marriage. Brown thinks actions like that are about silencing people, not promoting tolerance.
So he's saying that real tolerance means engaging with different viewpoints, even the ones you don't agree with.
Right. He encourages people to push back against these tactics and keep advocating for their beliefs. But to do it respectfully and truthfully.
It all comes back to taking the high road, even when it's hard.
Exactly. He thinks integrity and truthfulness will win out in the end.
Now, his third principle is where things get interesting. It's called Sexual Purity Trumps Sexual Anarchy. That's a loaded title.
It is, and it's fascinating. He argues that homosexuality is more accepted today not because we're more morally tolerant.
Wait, so what's his explanation?
He says it's because of a general decline in sexual morality overall.
He's saying that acceptance of homosexuality is a symptom of a bigger problem.
Exactly. He uses data from Gallup polls that show more and more people accepting things like premarital sex out of wedlock births, even polygamy.
It's like he's saying anything goes when it comes to sex. He calls it sexual anarchy, right?
Exactly. And he gives all these examples to show what he means by that. The normalization of sex tapes, Playboy models using their earnings for med school, reality shows about polyamory.
He even brought up how graphic sex education is getting in some schools.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to the values he's talking about. He's not shying away from calling out what he sees as a culture that's rejecting traditional ideas about sexual purity.
And he even brings up this old study by a British anthropologist named J.D. Unwin to support his argument.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating. Unwin studied 86 different societies throughout history, and he found a link between monogamy and how well a society does. The societies that embraced monogamy and had stricter sexual norms tended to be more stable and prosperous. The ones that were more relaxed about sex often declined and collapsed.
So he's saying that sexual restraint and traditional marriage are key for a healthy society.
Exactly. He thinks messing with those basic principles has serious consequences for everyone.
Which brings us to his fourth principle. Refuse to redefine marriage. This is a big one, right?
It is. He believes that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. Attempts to redefine it are not just wrong, but dangerous for society.
He talked about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. They both initially supported traditional marriage, but then changed their minds to support same-sex marriage.
Yeah, he uses that to show how powerful he thinks the gay agenda is. Even people who were opposed to it can change their minds.
He seemed especially concerned about how we use language when talking about marriage.
Right. He points out how terms like male wives and female husbands are becoming more common. He thinks when we redefine basic concepts like gender and marriage, it leads to confusion and weakens the whole idea of marriage.
And he didn't just focus on the words. He talked about the broader effects of redefining marriage on society.
He mentioned things like the rise of polyamory, kids being raised in non-traditional families, and even people having the legal right to marry objects. He mentioned a case in the UK where a woman legally married her dog.
Okay, that's taking things to a whole new level. It's like he's suggesting we're on a slippery slope moving away from traditional marriage without realizing the consequences.
That's exactly it. He believes we're messing with something sacred and fundamental without thinking about the long-term implications.
He also brought up the negative effects of fatherlessness on kids, right?
Yes. He argues that kids with both a mother and a father tend to do better in lots of areas. He cites statistics showing how fatherlessness is linked to higher rates of poverty, crime, teen pregnancy, even suicide.
It's heavy stuff, but it shows how strongly he believes in traditional families for the well-being of kids in society.
And he took it a step further, talking about a study on kids conceived through sperm donation.
Is that the My Daddy's Name is Donors study?
Yes. The study found that many of those kids have trouble with their identity and really want to know their biological fathers.
He even shared some heartbreaking parts of letters from those kids expressing their pain and confusion about not knowing where they came from.
It's powerful. It shows how alternative family structures can affect kids emotionally. And Brown uses it to support his argument that traditional families are the best for raising kids.
He even mentioned cases where kids conceived through sperm donation ended up dating their half-siblings without knowing.
It's disturbing. It shows the unintended consequences of moving away from the traditional family model. He even quoted a Danish professor who thinks incest between adult siblings should be legal because of how common sperm donation is.
That's a pretty extreme view.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder about the boundaries of family relationships.
Right. And Brown's point is that we're in uncharted territory with these new family structures, and we need to be careful about the consequences.
He even went as far as to encourage writers and journalists to put marriage in quotes when referring to same-sex marriage because he doesn't think it's real marriage. He's drawing a line in the sand.
He is. He's saying stand firm in defending traditional marriage, even when it feels like the whole world is moving in a different direction. He believes marriage is sacred, ordained by God, and redefining it is an attack on God's design.
So he's very clear about where he stands.
Absolutely. And he believes that in the end, society will realize the value of traditional marriage, even if it takes time. He's calling for a return to what he sees as the basic principles of marriage and family.
So we've covered a lot, and it's clear Brown sees redefining marriage as a huge turning point in this whole cultural shift. But he doesn't stop there. His next principle is all about gender distinctions.
Right. His fifth principle is celebrate gender distinctions. He's saying that this push for gender neutrality and the growing acceptance of transgenderism are really attempts to erase the differences between men and women.
So he's not on board with the idea that gender is just a social construct.
Nope. He thinks gender is rooted in biology. And ultimately, in God's creation, he takes it back to Genesis where it says, God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them.
So for him, it's not just about how we express ourselves. It's about something much deeper.
Exactly. And he sees blurring those lines as having negative consequences for individuals and for society as a whole.
He used some interesting real-world examples to illustrate that, didn't he?
Yeah. He talked about Facebook adding all those custom gender options, giving people all these identities to choose from beyond just male and female. And he pointed to Sweden. They've been pushing for gender neutrality for years. They even have a gender-neutral pronoun, hen, to replace he and she.
I've even heard about parents giving their kids names that don't traditionally match their biological sex, like giving a boy a girl's name.
He sees all of that as evidence of a shift away from recognizing the inherent differences between men and women. He's saying we're moving toward a world where biological sex doesn't matter, and he's really concerned about that.
But couldn't you argue that it's about giving people freedom to express themselves however they feel most comfortable?
That's a fair point, but Brown says blurring those distinctions has consequences in the real world. He talks about the challenges transgender individuals face, especially high rates of suicide and mental health problems. He thinks encouraging people to embrace a gender identity that goes against their biology can actually be harmful.
That's a really sensitive topic, and I can see how some people might find that controversial.
Definitely. He also brings up concerns about the safety and privacy of women and girls in places like bathrooms and locker rooms when transgender individuals are allowed to use facilities that don't align with their biological sex.
He shared a pretty disturbing example in the book, if I remember right.
He did. It involved a biological male who identifies as a lesbian and is attracted to women. Because this person legally can use women's facilities, Brown says it raises serious safety concerns for women.
It's a tough situation because you're trying to balance the rights and needs of different groups. It's not always clear-cut.
Exactly. And Brown knows it's complex, but he thinks we need to be talking honestly about these challenges without shutting down different opinions. He says the push for transgender rights often comes at the expense of women's rights and safety, and he wants a more balanced approach.
It's definitely a conversation we need to be having, and it's one that's probably going to continue for a long time.
For sure. These are complex issues with no easy answers.
Okay, so moving on to his sixth principle. It's called keep propagating the truth until the lies are dispelled. That sounds pretty intense. What's he talking about here?
This is where he gets into what he sees as the false narratives being spread by the gay agenda. He believes there's a lot of misinformation out there, and he wants people to actively fight against it.
He seemed really concerned about the media's role in all this.
Yeah. He says the media often makes the LGBTQ population seem way bigger than it is. He mentioned Gallup polls where people estimated that over 30% of the population is gay or lesbian.
That seems high.
It is. Brown says the real number is closer to 2%. He thinks this kind of media overrepresentation distorts reality and makes people think homosexuality is way more common than it actually is.
So he's basically saying the media is shaping how people see things in a way that's not accurate.
Exactly. He also says the media promotes a one-sided story, often silencing or ignoring voices that challenge the acceptance of homosexuality. He used the Benham brothers as an example.
Oh yeah, those were the twin brothers who had a reality TV show canceled by HGTV. What happened there?
They were successful businessmen, family men, but they also held conservative Christian beliefs. Well, a left-leaning activist group told HGTV about their views, and the network canceled their show.
Wow, so they were blacklisted because of their beliefs.
That's how Brown sees it. He uses it as proof that the media doesn't tolerate different views, even when they're expressed respectfully.
It's like he's saying there's no room for debate or disagreement on these issues.
Right. And then he went even further. He talked about specific myths he thinks gay activism promotes.
This is where he really dives into the arguments, right?
He does. For example, he questions whether homophobia is the main reason gay individuals suffer. He believes relationship problems and lifestyle choices are much bigger factors. He also disagrees with the idea that homosexuality is something you're born with and can't change.
That's pretty bold considering the whole born this way argument has been so important for the gay rights movement.
It is, but Brown points to statements from the American Psychological Association saying there's no scientific consensus on what causes sexual orientation.
He's basically saying the science isn't settled.
Exactly. He also challenges how the Matthew Shepard murder is often portrayed as a purely anti-gay hate crime.
That was the young man who was beaten and left to die because he was gay, right?
Yes, it was a horrible crime, and it became really important for the gay rights movement. But Brown gives evidence suggesting the murder was more complicated than that. Not just about homophobia, he says the story has been used to push a certain agenda.
That's controversial. I bet a lot of people wouldn't agree with that.
Definitely not. But remember, we're not here to decide if Brown's right or wrong. We're trying to understand his perspective. And he's definitely challenging some common narratives around these issues.
He also criticized comparing the gay rights movement to the civil rights movement.
Right. He says the struggles of African Americans are unique and can't be compared to the experiences of LGBTQ people. He emphasizes that he's not trying to minimize anyone's suffering, just pointing out the different nature of their struggles.
It's a sensitive topic for sure, and one that's going to cause a lot of debate.
Absolutely. But it shows how Brown is willing to challenge deeply held beliefs and push back against what he sees as a distorted view of reality.
Yeah, it's a powerful image for sure. But standing up to that tide can be tough. It can cost you something personally. It's not always easy to hold on to your beliefs when it feels like everyone is against you.
True Brain knows that. He knows there are challenges to pushing back against this dominant narrative. He's not pretending it's easy. He says it might mean sacrifice. You might be misunderstood or even lose friends.
But he seems to think it's just too important to stay silent.
Yeah. He's convinced that society's future depends on whether people are willing to stand up for what he sees as the truth about marriage, family, sexuality. For him, it's a spiritual battle at its core.
So if we zoom out and look at all 8 of these principles, what's the heart of Brown's argument?
It comes down to this. He thinks the gay revolution is based on lies and distortions. He says it can't last, and he predicts a big cultural shift back to traditional values.
Is that realistic, though? We've seen huge changes in attitudes toward LGBTQ issues recently. Is there any reason to think that'll reverse?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Brown argues that culture can change fast and in ways we don't expect. He uses examples like the big changes in morals during the 1960s. Very few people saw that coming.
He also talked about how conservative religious groups have made a comeback in recent decades.
Yeah,
That's true. It reminds us that we can't always predict what's going to happen with culture.
exactly. And he thinks a similar comeback for traditional values could happen. He sees hints of it already in the younger generation, especially evangelicals. They seem to be holding on to their traditional beliefs about sexuality, even as those beliefs become less popular.
So he sees that as a hopeful sign. Things might not be as one-sided as they seem.
Right, he's not saying it'll be easy or that they'll definitely win, but he believes that if people of faith stay strong in their beliefs, they can make a difference. They can help shape the future instead of just going along with the flow.
It's definitely a strong message. But how do Brown's claims match up with what we know from sociology? Are there arguments against what he's saying?
Well, his views are definitely different from the mainstream thinking on homosexuality. Most sociologists would say that growing acceptance of same-sex relationships is a good thing. It shows we're understanding and tolerating diversity better. Not that our morals are declining.
So Brown's basically swimming against the current here.
He is, and it's important to remember that he's coming from a specific perspective based on his religious beliefs. It's not a perspective everyone shares, not even most people.
But even if you don't agree with everything he says, there are some things in his argument that make you think right.
Absolutely. He raises good points about how important fathers are, the challenges for kids conceived through sperm donation, and the need for honest conversations about these complicated topics. Even if you don't agree with his conclusions, his book can start some important conversations.
It's a book that doesn't shy away from controversy, but it makes us think about some tough questions and what we really believe.
That's the value of looking at ideas that challenge our own. Even if we disagree in the end, it helps us think about what we believe and why.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
That's what we always want you to think about. What stuck with you from what Brown said? Did anything make you reconsider your own views on sexuality, marriage, or how society changes?
This deep dive has taken us through some really complicated and controversial stuff. But in the end, it's up to each person to figure out what they believe. What do you think the last chapter of this whole story will look like?
That's a question worth thinking about, and it's a conversation that's not ending anytime soon.